My wife snapped at the party, "Don't touch me." When I went to hug her as everyone watched, by morning, her whole double life was blown open. The moment she pushed me away, I knew. Not because of the rejection itself, but because her cold, clear "don't touch me" echoed across the silent room, telling me my entire life was a lie. The silence that followed was suffocating, the kind where you can almost hear everyone else holding their breath. I just stood there, hands still halfway raised, utterly frozen, while Chloe simply turned back to her conversation circle as if nothing had happened. It wasn't just embarrassing, it was the exact second I realized my 12-year marriage had been dead for months, and I was the only one who didn't know it. This was the story of how one sentence at a corporate party unraveled everything, exposing a twisted plan involving my wife, her family, and a man I thought was just her coworker. The worst part wasn't the public rejection. It was that nobody seemed surprised. A few people quickly looked away. Some suddenly found their phones absolutely fascinating, and one guy I barely knew gave me a look of pity that made my stomach clench. That's when I noticed Julian Hayes standing next to Chloe, closer than any coworker should be, his hand resting casually on the small of her back. Julian worked in her department, some senior analyst role that apparently required him to be at every single company event Chloe attended. I'd met him a handful of times over the past year, always getting the same polite smile and firm handshake. He was the kind of guy who seems perfectly harmless until you realize he's been playing chess while you're still figuring out the rules. He wasn't laughing or smirking, just stood there with this calm, almost bored expression, like he was watching a movie he'd already seen. Chloe was wearing the navy dress with silver details I'd complimented that morning, the one she said made her feel confident. She'd spent an hour getting ready, which wasn't unusual, but now I was replaying every detail in my head with a sickening new clarity. She hadn't asked me how I looked, hadn't really spoken to me in the car. And when we walked in, she'd immediately drifted toward Julian and his group. I'd told myself she was just networking, being professional, doing the whole career-driven woman thing I'd always supported. But standing there with my drink warming in my hand, everyone pretending they hadn't just witnessed my humiliation, I felt like the biggest fool in the room. Chloe's sister, Sophia, appeared at my elbow a few minutes later, her voice low and careful. "Hey, you okay?" she asked, and I could tell from her tone she'd seen everything. Sophia was the only one in Chloe's family who'd ever treated me like an actual person, not just some accessory to her sister's perfect life. So, I gave her an honest answer instead of the polite lie I'd been preparing. "Bad night," she tried to soften it, trying to give me an out. I looked at her directly and said something I didn't even know I was thinking until it came out of my mouth. "No, the last one." Sophia's face changed then, a flicker of something that might have been relief or maybe guilt. I couldn't tell which. She nodded slowly, squeezed my arm, and disappeared back into the crowd. I was left standing there with the distinct feeling I'd just crossed some invisible line. The party dragged on for another hour. Chloe didn't look at me once. I watched her laugh at Julian's jokes, saw her lean in when he whispered something, noticed the way her entire body language shifted when he was around, open and animated in a way she hadn't been with me in years. By the time we left, I'd made a decision, though I couldn't have told you exactly what it was yet. The drive home was completely silent. Not even the radio was playing because Chloe had turned it off the second we got in the car. She stared out the passenger window, jaw tight, hands folded in her lap like she was physically restraining herself from saying something. When we got to the house, she went straight to the bathroom and locked the door. It was bizarre, in 12 years of marriage, she'd never once locked that door. I stood in the hallway, listening to the water run, and this cold certainty settled over me, something fundamental had broken tonight and wasn't getting fixed. I went to the kitchen, poured myself a whiskey I didn't really want, and noticed Chloe's purse sitting on the counter where she'd dropped it. I'm not the kind of person who goes through other people's things, never have been. Always believed that trust was more important than proof. But my hand was reaching for that purse before I'd even made a conscious choice. And when I opened it, I found a second phone. A cheap, prepaid thing that definitely wasn't the iPhone she carried everywhere. My hands were shaking when I turned it on, and the first message I saw made my blood run cold. "Tomorrow night, room 519. Can't wait." The text was from Julian, sent earlier that day. I scrolled up and found months of messages, hotel confirmations, inside jokes about me, discussions about their future together, conversations about how much longer Chloe needed to keep up appearances before she could leave. I put the phone back exactly where I'd found it and sat down at the kitchen table with my whiskey, my mind racing through every conversation, every late night at the office, every weekend business trip that had seemed so reasonable at the time. Chloe came out of the bathroom 20 minutes later in her pajamas, her makeup scrubbed off, looking tired and small in a way that might have made me feel sorry for her if I hadn't just read those messages. She didn't say goodnight, just walked past me like I was furniture, and went upstairs to the bedroom. I stayed at that table until 3 o'clock in the morning, not drinking, not moving, just sitting there in the dark, realizing that the worst part wasn't the infidelity itself. The worst part was how easy she thought this would be, how completely she believed I'd never look deeper, never question, never fight back. She'd built this entire second life right under my nose and hadn't even bothered to cover her tracks properly because she was that confident I'd never notice. I thought about that moment at the party, the way she'd said those words with such casual cruelty, and understood it hadn't been spontaneous. It had been a message, a public declaration that I didn't matter anymore, that whatever we had was over, and she wasn't even trying to hide it. What she didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that I'd already started planning my next move. I didn't know all the details yet, didn't have the full picture, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty: I wasn't going to be the fool in this story anymore. I still didn't know exactly who was involved or how deep this went, but I could feel it. This sense that I was standing alone in a room where everyone else already knew the ending. That feeling, more than anything else, told me this was bigger than just Chloe and Julian, bigger than a simple affair. And I was about to find out just how wrong I'd been about everything. I barely slept 3 hours before calling Chloe's sister Sophia late the next morning, asking her to meet me for coffee. I kept it casual, just said I needed to talk about something important, and she agreed immediately, too immediately, like she'd been expecting this call. We met at a small cafe downtown, the kind of place where nobody from Chloe's social circle would accidentally run into us. Sophia looked nervous the second she sat down. She ordered a latte she didn't drink, kept fidgeting with the sleeve on her cup, and wouldn't make eye contact for the first few minutes. I didn't push, just let the silence stretch until she couldn't take it anymore. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet and guilty. "Julian influences Chloe more than you think," she said, and the way she said it, like she was confessing something she'd been holding on to for months, made my chest tighten. I asked her what she meant by that, keeping my voice calm even though my heart was pounding. She looked at me with an expression that was half pity and half relief. She didn't give me details, wouldn't say exactly what she knew. But the way she kept apologizing and saying she should have told me sooner made it clear this wasn't news to her. Sophia had known, maybe not everything, but enough. And she'd stayed quiet while I walked around like an idiot, thinking my marriage was just going through a rough patch. When I left that cafe, I felt sick. Not because of what Sophia had said, but because of what she hadn't said. All those careful pauses and loaded glances that told me this went deeper than one affair. I was halfway home when my phone rang, and Chloe's mother, Deborah's, name flashed on the screen. I almost didn't answer because talking to Deborah was usually an exercise in being lectured about my shortcomings. But something made me pick up. Maybe curiosity, maybe just the need to know how bad this really was. Her voice was cold and rehearsed, like she'd practiced exactly what she was going to say. And within 30 seconds, I understood that this call wasn't random. "You're holding her back," Deborah said. No greeting, no pretense of concern, just straight into the attack. She went on about how Chloe needed space to grow, how I was making things harder than they needed to be, how a real husband would understand when it was time to step aside. The whole speech had this weird quality, like she was reading from a script someone else had written. And I realized with absolute clarity that this wasn't a concerned mother calling to check on her daughter's marriage. This was damage control, someone trying to get ahead of a story they knew was about to break. Deborah had never liked me, that was nothing new. But this was different. This was coordinated. She was talking to me like the decision had already been made, like my role in this entire situation was just to sign whatever papers they put in front of me and disappear quietly. I hung up on her mid-sentence, something I'd never done before, and sat in my car for 20 minutes trying to process what was happening. When I got home, Chloe was at work, or at least that's where she said she was going, and I went straight to her office where she kept all her personal documents. The second phone was gone from her purse. She'd obviously realized I might look. But people who are hiding things always make mistakes, and Chloe was no exception. I found a tablet she rarely used shoved in the back of her desk drawer. When I turned it on, it was still logged into her email. There were messages from Julian, casual and familiar in a way that made my skin crawl, talking about dinner plans and weekend trips, and inside jokes that clearly went back months. But what caught my attention was a message from 3 weeks ago with the subject line "Next Steps." When I opened it, my entire world shifted. They weren't just having an affair. They were planning my exit, discussing how to position me as unstable, how to make sure Chloe got the house and most of our assets, even talking about witnesses who could testify to my supposed erratic behavior. Sophia's name was in that email along with a question about whether she'd be willing to make a statement if it came to that. I took photos of everything with my own phone, my hands steady, even though I felt like I was watching someone else's life fall apart. Then I put the tablet back exactly where I'd found it. That's when I decided to call a private investigator. Not because I needed more proof for myself, but because I needed documentation that would hold up if this turned into a legal battle. I found David Scott through a lawyer friend who owed me a favor. When we met the next day, David listened to my story without interrupting once. He was in his 50s, calm and professional, the kind of guy who'd seen every variation of human betrayal and wasn't impressed by any of it anymore. "If this is real, it won't take long," he said. And something about his confidence made me feel less crazy, like maybe I wasn't overreacting or imagining conspiracies where none existed. David worked fast, coming back to me within 2 weeks with a folder so thick I needed both hands to carry it. There were photos of Chloe and Julian at restaurants, hotels, his apartment, her car parked outside his building overnight. There were credit card statements showing charges at expensive hotels on nights Chloe had told me she was at business conferences. There were phone records with hundreds of calls and texts between them going back almost a year. There were even bank transfers, Chloe moving money from our joint account into a separate one I didn't know existed. Small amounts at first, but getting bigger over time. David had timeline charts, location data, witness statements from hotel staff who recognized them as regulars. They hadn't been careful, hadn't really tried to hide anything because they genuinely didn't think I was enough of a threat to bother covering their tracks properly. The worst part came when David showed me the last piece of evidence, a recording he'd gotten from a source he wouldn't name. It was Chloe and Julian in his car, parked somewhere private, talking about the divorce they were planning. Chloe's voice was different, lighter, more animated than I'd heard it in years. Talking about how easy it would be to paint me as controlling and jealous, how her family would back her up completely, how I'd probably just accept whatever settlement they offered because I always took the path of least resistance. Julian was encouraging her, making jokes about how I'd lipped at the party when she pushed me away, calling me pathetic in that casual way that told me this wasn't the first time they'd discussed me like this. I listened to the whole thing sitting in David's office, my face probably blank because I'd run out of emotional reaction somewhere around the hotel photos. When it was over, David asked me what I wanted to do next. And I told him to keep digging, find everything. Because if they thought I was going to roll over and make this easy, they'd seriously miscalculated who they were dealing with. That night, Sophia called me, her voice shaking, and said something that confirmed what I already suspected. "They asked me to testify against you," she said, and I could hear her crying on the other end of the line. She said Chloe had called her that afternoon, casual and friendly, working the conversation around to asking if Sophia would be willing to tell a lawyer about times I'd seemed angry or unreasonable or difficult to deal with. Sophia had refused, which was why she was calling me now, guilt and panic making her words tumble out faster than I could process them. I thanked her for telling me, kept my voice gentle even though I wanted to scream, and told her not to worry about it, that I had everything under control. I didn't, not really, but saying it out loud made it feel more true. I spent the rest of that night going through David's folder again, organizing everything chronologically, building a picture in my mind of exactly how long this had been going on and how many people had known about it while smiling to my face. They thought I was quiet because I was broken, too passive to fight back, too in love with Chloe to see what was right in front of me. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't quiet because I'd given up. I was quiet because I was preparing, gathering every piece of evidence I needed to make sure that when I finally made my move, there wouldn't be any room for them to spin the narrative in their favor. I met with a divorce lawyer named Sarah Jenkins on a cold morning 2 weeks after I'd started collecting evidence. The first thing she said when I walked into her office was that I looked tired. I told her I hadn't been sleeping much, which was true, and she nodded like she'd heard that 1,000 times before. Sarah had a reputation for being ruthless in court, the kind of attorney who didn't waste time on sympathy or small talk. When I laid out David's folder on her desk, she spent 40 minutes going through every page without saying a word. When she finally looked up at me, her expression was serious, but not surprised, like she'd seen this exact scenario play out with different names and faces more times than she could count. "You're not in a marriage. You're in a war," she said. And something about hearing it stated that plainly made everything feel more real. We spent the next 3 hours building a strategy, going through financial records, talking about how to protect assets and reputation when the other side was already planning to destroy both. Sarah was methodical, asking questions I hadn't thought of, finding holes in my documentation that needed filling, making me realize that being right wasn't enough if I couldn't prove it in a way that would hold up under scrutiny. She told me to keep acting normal. Don't let Chloe know I was onto her. Don't confront anyone or make accusations. Just gather more evidence and wait for the right moment to file. The hardest part was going home that night and pretending everything was fine, sitting across from Chloe at dinner while she talked about her day at work, and I nodded in all the right places, knowing that she was probably texting Julian the second I left the room. 2 days later, Chloe came home from work early, which was unusual, and dropped a manila envelope on the kitchen table in front of me. "Just sign." "I've endured enough," she said, her voice tight with frustration, like I was being difficult by existing in her space. I opened the envelope and found divorce papers already filled out with terms that were laughably one-sided. She wanted the house, the car, most of our savings, and she'd even included a clause about me covering her legal fees. There was a paragraph about my supposed emotional instability, carefully worded to sound reasonable while painting me as someone who'd been difficult to live with for years. I read through the whole thing slowly, watching Chloe's face get more impatient with every page I turned. When I finished, I sat it down and told her I needed time to think about it. She looked genuinely shocked, like she'd expected me to sign immediately and thank her for making it easy. "There's nothing to think about," she said, her voice getting sharper. "This is what's happening, Ethan. You can either make it simple or make it ugly." I told her I'd have my lawyer look at it, keeping my voice calm and neutral. And she actually laughed at that, a bitter sound that told me she thought I was bluffing. She didn't know I'd already been working with Sarah for weeks, didn't know about David's folder or the evidence I'd been collecting. She still believed I was the same passive guy who'd let her push him away at that party without saying a word. The breaking point came 3 days later when Chloe's family called a meeting at her parents' house. One of those formal sit-downs that was clearly meant to be an intervention. I showed up because refusing would have tipped my hand. The second I walked in, I could tell from everyone's faces that they'd already decided how this was going to go. Deborah sat at the head of the table like a judge. Chloe's father, Robert, stood behind her, looking uncomfortable but compliant. Sophia was there but wouldn't meet my eyes, and Chloe sat next to Julian, which was bold, even by their standards. They'd actually invited him to a family meeting about their daughter's marriage, and nobody seemed to think that was strange. Deborah started talking about how marriages sometimes run their course, how Chloe deserved to be happy, how I needed to accept that this relationship had reached its natural end. Robert added something about respecting Chloe's choices and not dragging things out unnecessarily. Julian didn't say anything, but his presence said everything, this quiet confirmation that he was already part of the family and I was just a problem to be solved. I sat there listening to all of it, nodding occasionally, asking clarifying questions that made them think I was coming around to their way of thinking. Sophia looked miserable the entire time, kept opening her mouth like she wanted to say something and then closing it again. When Deborah finally asked if I understood what they were telling me, I said yes, I understood perfectly. I could see the relief on all their faces, except Sophia's, who looked like she might cry. That night, I called Sarah and told her it was time to move. The next morning, before Chloe even woke up, I filed for divorce with all of David's evidence attached. Sarah had prepared everything perfectly, a comprehensive filing that included photos, bank statements, phone records, witness testimonies, and a detailed timeline of Chloe's affair and the conspiracy to defraud me in the divorce. I had copies delivered to Chloe at her office, to Julian at his desk 3 floors up, to Deborah and Robert's house, even to the HR department at Chloe's company since their affair violated about 6 different workplace policies. By noon, my phone was exploding with calls and texts that I ignored. By evening, Chloe showed up at the house in a state I'd never seen her in before. She wasn't angry or defensive. She was panicking, her voice shaking as she demanded to know where I got all that information and why I was doing this to her. "You didn't betray me by loving someone else," I said. "You betrayed me because you thought I'd never stand up for myself." And something about finally saying it out loud made my voice steadier than it had been in weeks. She tried to argue, tried to spin it like I was overreacting or misunderstanding what the evidence showed, but there was no conviction behind her words anymore. Julian had apparently already lawyered up and stopped returning her calls. Deborah had left 3 increasingly frantic voicemails about needing to talk immediately, and Chloe's company had put both her and Julian on administrative leave, pending an investigation. Everything she'd built, this whole carefully constructed plan to exit our marriage on her terms while making me look like the problem, had collapsed in less than 12 hours because she'd underestimated me so completely that she didn't bother covering her tracks. The divorce took 4 months to finalize, faster than usual, because Chloe's lawyer knew they had no defense against the evidence Sarah presented. Chloe tried to negotiate a few times, wanted to settle quietly and avoid a trial, but Sarah advised me to let it go to court, and I'm glad I listened. The judge was not sympathetic to someone who'd planned to commit fraud while conducting an affair with a coworker, and the final settlement was about as fair as these things ever get. I kept the house. We split the savings equally after Chloe paid back what she'd moved into her secret account, and she ended up covering most of her own legal fees. Julian got fired after the company investigation confirmed multiple policy violations, and last I heard, he and Chloe weren't together anymore. Apparently, relationships built on deception don't hold up well under pressure. Deborah stopped calling after the settlement was finalized, which was honestly a relief, and Sophia reached out a few months later to apologize again. I told her I understood she'd been in an impossible position, which was mostly true, and we still talk occasionally, though things will probably never be quite the same. I moved into a smaller apartment downtown 6 months after the divorce was final. One of those modern places with big windows and hardwood floors that doesn't have any memories attached to it. I make tea in the mornings and sit by the window watching the city wake up. And sometimes I think about that night at the party when Chloe pushed me away and how completely different my life is now. I didn't win, exactly. Winning would mean none of this ever happened. But I stopped losing myself in the process of trying to save something that was already gone. Sometimes I still feel angry about the time I wasted, the lies I believed, the way an entire family tried to make me doubt my own reality. But most days, I just feel a quiet strength. The good kind of quiet that comes from knowing exactly who you are, and refusing to apologize for it anymore. What would you have done if you were in my shoes?